Good afternoon or good morning, depending on your time zone. Welcome to our webinar, Federal Policy Update on Child and Youth Homelessness. I am Barbara Duffield, and I am the Executive Director of Schoolhouse Connection. We are again partnering on this webinar with the National Network for Youth. Just a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar will last for 1 hour. As always, we ask that you type your questions into the Q&A box. You can do that at any time. But if you type the questions into the Q&A box, it makes it easier for us to follow along and answer just as many questions as we possibly can over the course of the webinar. We also want to let everyone know this session is being recorded and also that we will issue a certificate for attendance. And if there are topics and you want to continue to connect with us and with others who are attending this webinar, you can sign up for our Slack community on Slack at the link that's in the slide. We will, throughout the webinar, be putting the link to the PowerPoint slides, so you'll have those as well. If this is your first webinar with Schoolhouse Connection, welcome. We're a national organization working to overcome homelessness from prenatal to post-secondary. We engage in advocacy at the federal level and at the state level, provide a lot of practical assistance to communities, and we are very proud to partner with young people in our youth leadership and scholarship program. Lots more about our organization on the website. And with that, I want to just turn it over for an introduction to Darla Bardine with the National Network for Youth.
Thank you, Barbara. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Darla Bardine. For those of you who aren't familiar with the National Network for Youth, we partner with youth service provider agencies, other community partners, and young people with lived experience to transform systems so that no young person in America experiences homelessness. I'll pass it back to you, Barbara.
Thank you. So this, I think, is our 7th federal policy webinar of 2025 and the 5th that we have done jointly with the National Network for Youth. And as with all of the 2025 webinars, there's a lot to share. So to give you a sense of what our agenda is, today's roadmap, we want to start out by talking about fiscal year 2026 federal funding. This is what's in the headlines. This is what people are focused on right now in terms of will the government shut down? What does it look like? What happens if it does shut down? What really is at stake for children, youth, and families who are experiencing homelessness? So we put that up top. We'll talk about that first. But then we want to take a step back and talk a little bit about some of the disruptions in federal funding that we're seeing for funds that were previously approved by Congress and signed into law. And so we'll look at the FY 2025 cancellations and rerouting and delays across the agencies that most impact children, youth, and families who are experiencing homelessness. We'll spend some time also talking about some federal agency actions and executive actions and litigation that are currently playing out. And then we want to close out by talking about some pending housing and higher education legislation that we're excited about. And again, always to make the point that individual action matters and your advocacy continues to matter greatly. So without further ado, I will start us off by talking about the state of play. What do we know right now about fiscal year 2026 appropriations? So we are days away from the deadline for funding the federal government. September 30th is the deadline, which means if there is not an agreement at 12:01 a.m. on October 1st, we will be facing a government shutdown. How we got here, there are 12 appropriations bills. Only 3 of them have passed both chambers. So that means that there are 9 funding bills that remain that have not been resolved yet by the House and the Senate. Those do include the funding bills for labor, health, human services, education, and housing. And the challenge is that the House and the Senate are very, very far apart in terms of their funding levels and the policies for those remaining bills. I say the House and the Senate are very far apart because despite all of the focus and the attention on the partisan differences that are leading to this increasingly likely shutdown, if you look at the way these bills are written, there's actually more bipartisan support in the Senate bill than I think people really appreciate. So if we look at these 2 bills, the House bills largely reflect the president's cuts and policy priorities. They are largely partisan. They are basically passing out of committee entirely on Republican votes. If you look at the Senate bills, the Senate appropriations bills, most of those reject many of the president's cuts and priorities, and they are much more bipartisan. So, again, just to give you an example, for the bill that funds education, early care, human services, that passed out of committee with only 3 no votes. So it was a very, very, very bipartisan bill. But nonetheless, the two chambers are very far apart. So, where are we now? There are two competing proposals to keep the government open, and we've summarized here the majority proposal and the Democrat proposal. I think the details of these two proposals matter less than the fact that they're different. They're not on the same page. We highlighted in red one feature of the Democrat proposal to keep the government open. I mean, both of them give more time to hash out a deal on the larger government funding issues. Both of them provide increased funding for member security and for executive branch security. But one big difference within the Democratic proposal is policies that would limit the president's ability to withhold funding that Congress approves. And that, in many ways, is the crux of the issue, is a struggle over the power of the purse. The Constitution gives the power of the purse to Congress, but that is not how this White House sees things. So that is a big part of what is playing out. We really also want to emphasize that neither of these proposals are likely to become law. These are essentially what they're starting with, the negotiating points, the proposals that are being put forward to negotiate, and we'll see what happens in the end. But these are the two proposals, again, not likely to be resolved before next week, unfortunately. On the next slide, we want to share a little bit about just generally about continuing resolutions. So the previous slide, both of those were continuing resolutions, meaning they just keep things going pretty much at the same pace. And short-term continuing resolutions do just that. Sometimes there are policy changes or a little bit of money added, but generally they just keep things going. But there's important things to know about continuing resolutions, particularly if they're longer. Like if they were to kick the can into January, for example, or like this year, where they essentially did a full year continuing resolution. So generally, continuing resolutions don't specify the exact funding amount for many federal programs. So what that means is that in a full year continuing resolution, some programs are much more vulnerable to the administration defunding or rerouting. Another big difference between a continuing resolution and an actual negotiated appropriations bill is that continuing resolutions tend not to include very many policy provisions. They may have some, but not the way a typical appropriations bill would, for example, have language about allowable uses of funds or directions for federal agencies to do certain things. So both the National Network for Youth and Schoolhouse Connection, when we work on appropriations bills, yes, we're advocating for more funding for the programs that are supporting children, youth, and families, but we're also working in appropriations for policies that can help the implementation or further those. And that's not a possibility, generally speaking, with a continuing resolution. And then lastly, typically continuing resolutions don't include earmarks, so those congressionally directed fundings, those line items that members will ask for funding in their own districts. So again, short-term continuing resolutions, 7 weeks, like the ones that are being described, less of a big deal. But a continuing resolution that is longer, that goes into 2026 or beyond, then we've got some of the problems that are laid out on this slide. What happens if there is a government shutdown? Again, it's increasingly likely. So we thought it was important to talk about in general what happens and then some specific things to keep in mind. In general, when there's a government shutdown, the executive branch, the White House, has very broad authority to determine which agencies or offices close, who gets paid. So, for example, federal employees can be ordered to come to work and not get paid, and which funding goes out or doesn't go out for particular programs. Typically, each federal agency would post to its website a contingency plan that lays out for that agency which programs will continue, which staff will come in, which won't. As of right now, there aren't any contingency plans posted, so it's unclear if or when those will be posted. Within the realm of education, generally, because education's forward funded, you won't see the same sorts of disruptions that you would see for other programs, with some exceptions. So there are four of the biggest federal education programs have what's called advanced funding, which means some of their fiscal year 2026 funding is already passed. It was passed as part of FY25. So those are programs where a portion of their funding could potentially be disrupted depending on what the White House states. So that would be Title I, education for the disadvantaged, Title II, which is effective teacher instruction, teacher training, special education state grants, and career and technical education grants. I want to emphasize that nothing is, we don't, again, this would be a White House decision in the case of a shutdown, whether and how those funding streams would go out. So that's some of what it would look like, and with a little bit of more emphasis on education. And I'm going to turn it over to Trinity to talk about other repercussions of a government shutdown for ACF, HHS, and HUD programs.
Yes, thanks, Barbara. Hi, everyone. My name is Trinity Maddock from the National Network for Youth. So we know many of you on this call receive discretionary grants. So these are the grants that you have to compete for. And payments from these grants will likely be affected by a shutdown. Now, in previous shutdowns, most discretionary grants from the Department of Housing and Urban Development have been paused. So Continuum of Care, Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, rental assistance, payments from these programs have been paused in previous shutdowns. On the other hand, payments from grant programs at the Department of Health and Human Services have typically been allowed to continue during a shutdown. So this would include payments for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program and a Head Start. However, most employees at HHS get furloughed, meaning they're temporarily not allowed to work. So HHS will keep on a few employees, but because their capacity is extremely limited, payments sometimes are still late, or they may not be able to answer questions, things like that. So all of that is what has happened in previous shutdowns. But if the government shuts down this time, it could be a little different because of the administration's new policy that the Office of Management and Budget has to review and approve discretionary grant payments. And we know that DOGE has been involved in this process as well. So we don't know how OMB and DOGE would be affected by a shutdown. It's likely that many of them would be furloughed, so their ability to review and approve payments will, at the very least, be highly limited. So it's possible that programs that have historically continued during shutdowns, like RHYA and Head Start, may not at this time, kind of depending on what that review process looks like. So I know there's a lot of unknowns, but all in all, if you are waiting to hear about a new award and you haven't heard anything before a shutdown occurs, then that announcement will almost certainly be delayed. New awards are probably going to be pretty low on their priority list during a shutdown. If you're due to draw down funding for an existing grant during the shutdown, that payment could be delayed as well, just kind of depending on how they want to approve those payments and who's available to approve them. So really, if you have discretionary grants of any kind, just prepare for funding gaps. A shutdown could be a couple of days, but it could be longer. It's kind of impossible to say at this point. So it's best to just be prepared in case.
Thanks so much for that, Trinity. Hi, everyone. My name is TJ Lucas, and I'm the Senior Manager of Federal Policy at Schoolhouse Connection. And I'm going to build upon what Barbara and Trinity has been talking about in regards to FY26 by sharing specifically what is at stake for children, youth, and families experiencing homelessness as we know it at this current moment. On the next slide, we're going to take just a moment to talk about one bright spot in the midst of all of this uncertainty, and that is the Education for Homeless Children and Youth programs advocacy when that has taken place over the course of this year. Specifically, I'm referring to the fact that President Trump, in his budget for FY26, proposed to eliminate the EHCY program via consolidation with 18 other federal education programs. As we know, this would have completely disrupted the services that children and youth experiencing homelessness receive in their schools. And we got to work immediately following the release of this budget to ensure that members of Congress were aware that this was problematic for our children, youth, and families, and more importantly, to ask them to preserve this in their budgets as they began the process to develop the FY26 federal budget. And so specifically, we focused on ensuring that members of the House Appropriations Committee were informed and educated about this program and the funding levels in their district, the number of students that had been identified, and specifically what funds were used for and how they supported children, youth, and families experiencing homelessness. What we found was that many of these staffers and congressional offices either were not directly aware of the EHCY program or had very little knowledge on what the funding was actually used for in their communities. And so we systematically, reached out to several of you who are here today watching, and many others to ask you to join us in these conversations. And we are so grateful that you did. And we just want to highlight again that both the House and the Senate rejected the block grant proposal. They maintained level funding for EHCY and went a step further and included language allowing those funds to be spent an additional year. That's because of you and your advocacy, and we are so grateful for it. There is a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot going on in the world right now, but taking a moment to really hone in on the fact that we were clear-eyed in our goals, and we were able to accomplish that because of joining together in all of the work that you do every day. And so I do want to be clear that this was not inevitable. There were several programs that the House bill eliminates completely. It is as a direct result of your advocacy efforts that we were able to maintain the funding necessary, the level funding that was included in both the House and Senate bills. And that specifically happened over 26 congressional meetings with over 90 homeless liaisons, their community partners, and many other folks that that care about our children, youth, and families. So thank you so much. And speaking of the House and Senate bills, I'm going to walk on the next slide through some of the programs that also are that we use funding to support our children, youth, and families experiencing homelessness. Specifically, want to call your attention to Title I, Part A. The Senate did include a slight increase, but the House did propose a 27% cut in Title I funding. We are very concerned about that because, as we know, the Title I Part A set aside is so important for our homeless children and youth. And I think it's important, before I go any further, to just draw your attention to the bottom of this slide where it says these funding levels must be negotiated. As you all may recall, the Senate issued their proposal and the House has issued their proposal. Neither of these are what will actually become law. It is just each chamber's negotiating or their starting point. So we will see some fluctuations. That is to say, we don't know if the Senate increase for Title I will be there, and we don't know if the House 27% cut will be there. So we're providing this information so that you have an understanding of the different dynamics and the reality that Congress, each year looks at each line item in the budget to decide the funding level. I will also just mention that the migrant education, Title I Part D, Title III English learners all were eliminated in the House bill. However, the Senate did level fund them. Special education programs received a slight increase in both chambers' bills. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the early care and childhood funding, particularly calling your attention to the preschool development grants, Child Care Access Means Parents in Schools program, and the IDEA preschool grants were all eliminated in the House while the remaining programs, including Head Start and the Child Care and Development Block Grant, were both continued funding and even increased in the Senate. On the higher education slide, which is next, it highlights the Pell Grants TRIO program, Gear Up, and then it also shows that the supplemental education opportunity grants in the federal work study were eliminated in the House bill. And so from these education fundings, what we know is that when members of Congress have a direct connection to how these funds are supporting their constituents, how this funding is ensuring that children and youth are getting their education, and they are more likely to support these programs. So again, thank you for all of your work and all of your advocacy. There is so much more to be done. We have to see this through the finish line, but we have demonstrable progress thus far. So I'm going to turn it over to Darla, who will talk a little bit more about some of the housing programs.
Thank you, TJ. Hi, everyone. So on this slide, you'll see that the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act was level funded in both the Senate and the House. The HUD Youth Homeless Demonstration Program and YESI, it was level funded in the Senate, but eliminated in the House for both 2025 and 2026. HUD Continuum of Care got an increase in both the Senate and the House. I do want to note that the House increase to the HUD COC funding comes by eliminating the Youth Homeless Demonstration Program and the Youth Homeless System Improvement Grants. So that's where that increase is coming from. Emergency Solution Grants are level funded in both. Job Corps and AmeriCorps got a 50% cut in the House. So that's where we are with those specific programs. And now we're going to shift. Okay, we were talking about FY 2026, what the different funding proposals say in the House and the Senate. I do want to underscore that those negotiations are ongoing. We do not know if it's going to be House or Senate or some combination thereof, or a continuing resolution. So we're going to shift now to fiscal year 2025 funding. I'm going to be talking about cancellations and rerouting and delays. So the FY 2025 bill was final, and like Barbara mentioned, that was a full year CR or continuing resolution, which basically continued fiscal year 2024 funds. That was finalized in March of this year, and their 2025 fiscal year is October 1, 2024 to September 30th of this year, 2025. And so because of the administration's significant priority shifts, a lot of FY 2025 funding has been canceled, rerouted, delayed, or is tied up in litigation. We could talk a lot about this, but we're really going to just zero in on some of the most critical programs and impacts for children, youth, and families experiencing homelessness. So I'm going to start with the Department of Education. So more than 24 TRIO grants are currently being withheld by the administration. Senators Merkley and Warnock led a bipartisan Senate letter to the U.S. Department of Education and OMB, urging them to immediately release those TRIO grant awards. Also, earlier this month, the Department of Education announced that it will be redirecting minority funding for minority-serving institutions, magnet schools, teacher preparation, gifted and talented, and arts education programs to funds that align with the administration priorities. And specifically, this funding is going to be redirected to include historically Black colleges and universities, tribally controlled colleges and universities, charter schools, and American history and civics programs. The U.S. Department of Education is claiming they have the legal authority to redirect these funds based on how it interprets the continuing resolution, which did not specify amounts for this program. We have talked about this in previous webinars, where usually an appropriations bill, the bill text itself will tell you the big number, budget going to a particular department within a federal agency. And then there is a chart, an addendum of a table that really specifies how much money each program gets. Our critique and fear with the fiscal year 2025 bill is that there was not that accompanying table that specified the grant award amount or the funding amount per federal program. We feared that that gave this administration too much flexibility. And it appears they are using this flexibility, the lack of that table specifying how much money each of these programs were to get. So they're using that, saying as long as we spend the money within the programs there, then we are in line with the continuing resolution. So that's the argument that they're making. Next slide, please. So now we're going to shift to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which administers the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act programs. So awards were submitted on July 28th for the Transitional Living Program, Basic Center Program, and Maternity Group Home grants funded through the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. The Street Outreach Program, which is usually a standalone grant, this cycle was collapsed into the other RHYA grant awards. So what we know, I guess one thing that's not listed here, due to the collapse, so there was the collapse of the Street Outreach Program, which we do not agree with, but there was an overall increase in the grant award amount from 200 to 250,000 per year to 350,000 per year. So we know that there's going to be a lot less grants given out this year because it was almost a doubling of the grant award amount per year. So there's going to be a significant reduction in the number of programs that get funded. We also know that the Family and Youth Services Bureau at HHS finished their reviews and submitted their recommendations to the Office of Management and Budget and DOGE as required by part of the administration's new process, and that OMB and DOGE conducted their reviews. And we also heard that they rejected some of the grant awards that FISB recommended. We heard that they rejected it based on DEI specific issues, but there's nothing in writing. We don't know anything official. This is just what we've heard. We also heard that award announcements are expected on September 30th, or sometimes it takes place October 1st. What we don't know, well, I guess there's a lot we don't know, but we don't know if and how many grant applications were rejected by OMB or DOGE. If they will be allowed to appeal. There is no right in law that allows an appeal, so I doubt that this administration would give more rights than they're required to. But we do, like Trinity talked about earlier, if a government shutdown occurs, we do expect the announcement of the RHYA grant awards to be delayed. And then the final slide for me is a little update on the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. There was a continuum of care builds NOFO. This is not the usual continuum of care, COC NOFO that goes out. This is specifically for PSH units for elderly and disabled individuals. There was a second NOFO. And this new NOFO requires projects to be in jurisdictions that enforce laws and ordinances prohibiting urban camping, or basically you have to criminalize homelessness and you have to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement to be even eligible to submit a NOFO and get this funding for PSU units. Not surprisingly, HUD is being sued over the requirements of this NOFO, which go above and beyond what we've seen in other NOFOs. There certainly have been a lot of harmful language we've seen in other NOFOs, but those NOFOs have include language like as permitted by current law or as applicable by federal law. There is none of that kind of couching language in this NOFO. It's just a straight out prohibition. And so that lawsuit is ongoing. And it argues that the requirements of this NOFO are too partisan and overstep the agency's authority. So we will be watching to see how that lawsuit plays out. And with that, I will pass it over to Trinity.
Thank you, Darla. Hello again, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to take you through some recent moves by the administration and federal agencies and some various lawsuits that we are watching very, very closely because the outcomes are really going to have an impact on all of your work. So a lot has been happening around this executive order, ending crime and disorder on America's streets. It's important to remember that executive orders can't override federal law, which is why the implementation of many of these executive orders are being challenged in court. But we are seeing the legal power that executive orders do have, which is over the priorities and some policies at federal agencies. And we've certainly been seeing a lot of impacts from this executive order lately, which is really trying to, as Darla mentioned, kind of move federal homelessness policy in a more punitive direction, away from harm reduction, away from like a public health approach, encouraging states and localities to incarcerate or involuntarily commit unsheltered individuals, particularly those who are using substances or who have mental health issues, and a large emphasis, on sharing data with law enforcement to improve public safety. And the Supreme Court's Grants Pass decision from last year really legally kind of opened the door to allow these kinds of policies, executive orders, everything to flourish. And that was the decision last year that determined it is not considered cruel and unusual punishment to fine or arrest an unsheltered individual for sleeping outside, even if there are no alternatives in the area. So a big update from the Administration for Children and Families at the Department of Health and Human Services. They recently released their new strategic initiative that details all of their new guiding principles that are going to determine basically how they fund programs and research. And if you've taken a look at the initiative, you know that most of the provisions are very unaligned with known best practices for serving children and families, but especially those who have experienced homelessness or foster care or DV or the majority of populations that you all serve. So as you're reading through the initiative, you might see some provisions in there like, hey, isn't that being sued? Isn't that one being sued? And that one? Yes, there are a number of provisions in this initiative that have already appeared in other NOFOs or other guidance that are currently being challenged in court. So Darla just talked about how the COC builds NOFO included provisions from the executive order around criminalization and all of that. There is very similar, almost identical language in this ACF initiative. The difference is that the Build SNOFO used very strong language saying, programs absolutely can't be in a jurisdiction that isn't complying with the executive order. So because they use that strong language, there was that avenue for legal recourse. ACF, on the other hand, is very careful in this initiative to kind of couch their language like to the extent allowable by law or anything permitted by law, including court orders. So in this way, they're kind of protecting themselves from a lawsuit, but also teeing up so that if the lawsuits go their way, they'll be able to implement these provisions. They're kind of ready to hit the ground running because their guidance is already out there. In terms of the legality of some of the other provisions like the DEI, the gender ideology, the marriage provisions, or even really the impact of these provisions is really just going to depend on how ACF implements them. So right now it's kind of hard to say. We're not really going to know until new NOFOs come out or new grants are awarded or new grants are not awarded, because it's just not very clear how far ACF is going to go in actually implementing this initiative. And of course, all of these lawsuits kind of surrounding it are going to have an impact on that as well. And the last agency update I want to highlight is the guidance that came out from several agencies stating their intention to reinterpret what federal benefits programs immigrant youth and immigrant families can qualify for. So basically, the guidance was that immigrant youth and families can't access any federal benefits programs. That would include Head Start, education, and emergency health care. Now, 2 lawsuits were filed against this guidance, and both have put implementing the new guidance on hold. So for now, access is as usual. Immigrant youth and families can access Head Start, can access education, all the same federal programs that they could before. But this is, another lawsuit that we're watching very closely. And as I mentioned, and Darla mentioned too, the outcome of these lawsuits and many others that are happening are going to have an impact across programs and agencies. And I know it can be a little frustrating because there are a lot of unknowns right now. There's not really much advocacy that can be done with lawsuits. But just know that National Network for Youth and Schoolhouse Connection will continue to provide you with timely updates that are relevant to your work. We have our eye on all of these sort of moving pieces so that you can continue to provide services, and we'll keep you updated on what you need to know to do that, because there's a lot happening right now that's going to impact, this and that. And with that, I'll turn it over to TJ to talk about some better news in the legislative space.
Thanks, Trinity. In the midst of all of the chaos and the funding indecisions, Congress is actually working on legislation as well. And I'm going to highlight 3 specific bills that touch on the housing and higher education space. The first, some good news. The Housing for Homeless Students Act will be reintroduced in a bipartisan, bicameral fashion in the coming weeks. This bill specifically would allow students that have experienced homelessness and veterans that are homeless to seek full-time student status at institutions of higher education and qualified to live in low-income housing tax credit units. Currently, they are not eligible, inadvertently left out homeless students, as is the case with so many federal policies, which is why Barbara's going to tell you why we need you to be involved a little bit here. This bill will be led by Representative Danny Davis of Illinois, a longtime champion of this legislation. And joining him will be Representative Michael Carey, a Republican of Ohio. And in the Senate, the bill will be led by Senator Angus King, an independent of Maine. We hope to have a Senate Republican and are in the final stages of talks with an office right now. And so hopefully we will be able to share that update soon. But as soon as the bill is introduced, we will certainly blast it out to your email, so that way you can contact your members of Congress and let them know that this is an important piece of legislation that you would like to see them support. And specifically, it just ensures that students experiencing homelessness don't have to choose between being a full-time student and having a place to live. And on the next slide, I will talk a little bit about how the Senate has actually taken, for the first time in over a decade, has really come together and worked on a housing package, legislative package that passed the committee with unanimous consent back in July. And it is called the Renewing Opportunity in the American Dream, which is an acronym for ROAD to Housing Act. And it is the first legislation to advance in a long time, and specifically focuses on housing affordability, increasing the housing supply, and improving housing program. Unfortunately, the largest housing package that has passed the Senate fails to meaningfully incorporate provisions to support children and youth and families experiencing homelessness. We have been partnering between Schoolhouse Connection and the National Network for Youth and other national partners to educate members of Congress and their staff about the need for including other legislation specifically targeted to children and youth. It is certainly been an uphill battle, but specifically, we are disappointed that this package did not include either the bipartisan Homeless Children and Youth Act or the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act. And I'm going to talk just a little bit more on this next slide about the Homeless Children and Youth Act. As many of you know, it was reintroduced earlier this year by Senators Katie Britt of Alabama and Angela Alsobrooks of Maryland. And we're, first of all, we are so grateful for both offices and their teams for all of the work that they have done on introduction. But specifically, this bill would ensure that any child or youth that is identified by an existing federal definition of homelessness would be eligible to be screened for HUD homeless assistance programs and HUD programs in general. Specifically, we know children and youth, the vast majority of children and youth experiencing homelessness as identified under the U.S. Department of Education and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, among others, are often not eligible to be assessed for services under HUD programs because of the restrictive definition. And this bill would align that, and specifically, it would allow the applications to score primarily on whether they are cost effective in meeting the priorities and goals in their local communities. And there's some transparency pieces on the HUD data that would ensure that HUD also has to report the data that is already collected by other federal agencies, including a lot of the information provided by the U.S. Department of Education annually, which we know there is a big discrepancy in those numbers. And on this slide, I will flag your attention for the Take Action link here. It is also in the external links that I've been dropping in the chat. We'd love for you to just fill that out. It takes just a minute to send a note to your U.S. senators, letting them know that you would like them to co-sponsor this bill and that this issue is something that is important to you as a constituent of their state. So I will now pass it over to Barbara, who can share a little bit more about some of the advocacy efforts and how you can be involved.
Great. So if this is not your first federal policy webinar, you know that we are advocacy organizations. And even in this most difficult of year, we have seen that individual action matters and that local voices matter, regardless of what your role is. On the next slide, for example, we lay out some of our principles. Generally, I mean, as an organization, we are fiercely nonpartisan, but being nonpartisan does not mean being neutral. And so when we see policies that are harmful, we weigh in. But more than anything, I think to convey that when constituents have educational meetings with their elected officials or their staff, it's a much more civil discourse. I think the single thing that has given me some hope this year is just watching the way people can be adults and learn about issues that they don't necessarily know about, like child, youth, and family homelessness, which is so invisible, and then take positions that ultimately support programs. If I'm making it seem easy, it isn't, obviously, but that's what we're here for. That's what our jobs are, is to help make those connections for you. You may have data that we can use. You may have community partners you can connect with who are more free to advocate. You may be able to engage in something that's just educating, not lobbying, but just educating. So we want to continue to ask for your active involvement in that. And on the next slide, I think we just lay out a couple more pieces to really emphasize this point. You know, we saw time and time again in our meetings, specifically on McKinney-Vento, that 99%, maybe 97% of congressional staff had never heard about it, didn't know there were homeless children in their districts, and for them to hear about it for the first time from people who are working directly with families and children is very powerful. And we know that the National Network for Youth is doing the same thing on youth homelessness issues, whether it's RHYA or HUD. So again, just really, if you're curious about it, we're happy to have a conversation on the side or email to specifically emphasize that it can't just be national organizations here in DC talking to congressional staff. We answered a lot of questions, but I know that there are more. So I want to just see, there are some questions here related to HCYA, which I'm going to ask Trinity or TJ to respond while I look up the answer to the question about subgrants in Arizona. So hold on for just a second on that.
Yeah, I see one in the Q&A. Does HCYA add funding to the COC program to expand services to a much larger population than currently served? HCYA does not include any increased funding. You know, it's not an appropriations bill, so it doesn't address funding for the COC program. Really, it's about eligibility and allowing communities to be able to target the funding that they do have from the COC program to whatever subpopulations are most aligned with their plans to prevent and end homelessness. So we know, in some communities, the majority of their population may be experiencing hidden homelessness, like rural communities, for example. So it's really about allowing communities to use the funding that they do have in a more efficient way. Obviously, we want all programs to have billions and billions of dollars, but that's appropriations advocacy that we also work on and support. But HCYA's purpose is a little different.
Now, if I could
Uh,
just flag, and the HUD Continuum of Care funding stream has gotten increases by the billions over the past 15 years, whereas the RHYA and McKinney-Vento programs have gotten like 500,000, 1 million, 2 million increases. So it's a $4 billion program since the HERTH Act passed, and it was only $1 billion. So there's been a $3 billion increase in investment in HUD Continuum of Care funding and not the alignment of federal definitions. HUD still continues to have the most restrictive use of definitions. So just to flag, we're just reiterating, it's not about the funding. And the other question around what definitions would be aligned. So basically, what the bill says is if you are considered homeless by the McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act program, Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program, Head Start, other programs, then you would be eligible for HUD Continuum of Care funded programs. So it's a clean, clean definition. And I see Barbara's back, so I'll kick it back to her.
Thanks. So I was just checking in with our K-12 team, the question. So the U.S. Department of Education did say last year that all of the allowable uses of the American Rescue Plan, homeless children and youth funds do apply to regular McKinney-Vento funds, including gas cards. And then there was a question, like, can states limit that or restrict that? They certainly can. I should step back. All the uses except for hotels, motels. So gas cards, store cards, some of those really unique, flexible uses of funds do carry over, except for motels, hotels. And then the question was, can a state like, for example, Arizona restrict it? And the answer is that yes, they can. So I don't know if that's the case, but certainly nationally it is allowable. And we'll see if there are other questions here. I don't see any other questions. Yes, and I just selected our website manager. For whatever reason, our website would choose this moment to go down. So stay tuned for technical issues with the Schoolhouse Connection website. I'm sure we'll get it up shortly. So it's not your mistake if you got a gateway error. I actually got that same error myself just now when I was looking for it. So
just overwhelmed with traffic with everybody.
yes. And it is a lot of information. So in a nutshell, where should we place our advocacy and planning efforts around COC funding as it relates to the budget shutdown? This last pause caused many evictions due to not having funds to pay landlords and less funding reserves. So again, I'll direct this question to our friends at the National Network. Where would you direct your advocacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is whenever I went over the HUD Continuum of Care funding, it's increased in both the House and the Senate, right? So the funding I think is going to continue. for HUD continuums of care. I think the challenge we're having is at the administrative level with the harmful language being put in NOFOs, that you can't even apply for HUD NOFO funding if you're a sanctuary city. So I think that kind of administrative advocacy and educating your senators and your members of Congress about why those policies in NOFOs is so harmful to the work that you're trying to do to prevent and end child, youth, and family homelessness.
Yeah,
And
and
then in
I'll
terms of,
mm, mm,
oh, go ahead, Trinity.
just addressing the part as it relates to the budget shutdown too. But yeah, sounds like you too.
Yeah. And for shutdown, for HUD Continuum of Care funds, anything that requires like a monthly drawdown and a report, is there's going to be a delay. So I think again, communicating to your members of Congress, saying, hey, I don't have 30 days or 60 days of reserves to fill in the gap in funding. I rely on these fundings. People in your community rely on these fundings to stay housed, to stay safe, to stay healthy. I think that type of education around delays and being able to draw down the funds is critical because, these members of Congress and staffers, they haven't necessarily ever run an organization or a program and know all that goes into the amazing work that you guys do every day. And then just practical advice. It really is like you should anticipate delays. And we do sessions for our members about flexible ways. If you don't have reserves, if you don't have funding that you can dip into, if there's like temporary delays in getting paid for a grant that you have, there's like loans you can get, or maybe you can ask others and your partners to kind of float you some cash. So there are some strategies you can look at in the nonprofit kind of direct service space that I'll just flag as a resource. Our experience with the last shutdown is that the funding came eventually, it was just delayed. So if you have a written grant agreement where you should get a certain amount of money, it will come, but be delayed. And so I think just planning for that, doing scenario planning, projection, and really communicating to your elected officials the negative impact of the shutdown for those you serve is critical.
All right, we can continue to take questions for the remainder, but I'll just go through some final slides here. Some upcoming information from both organizations. I did want to call, there is so much happening all the time right now, and it is very challenging to keep up with what's going on. So one of the things that we have done, and I'm going to put it in the chat box here, is create a kind of a live tracker. I mean, it's not live in the sense of like we're typing it as they're doing things, but for the early care education space, as there are major decisions, we're putting them on that page. So I just put a link to it. You can look on that on a regular basis. It's updated more frequently than, for example, anything we would put out in our e-newsletter, for example. So court litigation, federal with funding, with all of those major actions would be there. And of course, you have the information for the national network there as well. And then on the next slide, I think this might be, Darla, for you. Yes, it is.
We have some upcoming webinars, so please join us on the 30th for our From Crisis to Action, Combating the Criminalization of Youth Homelessness After Grants Pass. It's going to discuss some strategies that you can take to advocate against criminalized ordinances or policies. We have 2 youth service providers and we have 2 young people that will be speaking, along with myself and Katie from the National Homelessness Law Center. And then we are launching a new publication, Breaking the Cycle of Homelessness, Supporting Young Parents and Their Children. And that is October 15th. These are open, these are free, so please register and join us.
Thank you very much. And here's a commercial advertisement for some Schoolhouse Connection webinars. We have webinars coming up on transportation, expanding college access with the Common App. That is not actually like an app as in a computer app. It's actually an application and a platform for financial aid, scholarships, and admissions. and we're really excited to be partnering with them. So we have a webinar on that coming up, determining eligibility. If you are in Alabama, we specifically have an Alabama-focused webinar on helping young people experiencing homelessness obtain medical care. And then we are also very close to having a new FAFSA. So next week, we do expect that the FAFSA will go out on time on October 1st. Maybe the only thing that happens on time on October 1st, but it will happen. And we'll be partnering with some colleagues to do a webinar on that FAFSA in early November. So let's see, I think, Darla, I think you're up next too.
Oh no,
I
this is
lied.
you.
It's Schoolhouse Connection, just some additional resources, particularly as it relates to McKinney-Vento advocacy.
Next slide, please. So we are a membership organization. We are kicking off our 2026 membership drive October 1st. If you join as a member now, you'll be a member through the end of next year. So please consider joining us. And I think next slide is us too. We have a vital document legal hotline that we have launched with Baker McKenzie Law Firm. It is text or call. Lawyers answer the phone. It is Wednesdays and all the time around there. It's 1-888-870-DOC. So please, and you can leave a voicemail. You can call at any time, and your phone call will be returned. And we're gathering a lot of data there as well. We'll have more of that to share early next year. And I think next slide, you're all invited to our 2026 summit, March 12th and 13th. That's a Thursday and Friday in Washington, D.C. Schoolhouse Connection does our education track, which is amazing. So please, early registration is open. So the lowest prices are currently available. You can go to our website and register, and more information about the agenda will be coming. And we have an RFP if you want to present. That is open, I believe, till the end of this month. And it is highly competitive, but if you aren't interested in presenting, please submit an RFP.
Thank you, Darla. So we are committed to continuing to do these federal policy webinars jointly. We've been averaging about, I guess, every 6 or 7 weeks. So as soon as we have critical mass and there's enough to talk about, we could do them every single day probably, but that would be too much. But we will be continuing to work together to provide this information for you. Please follow up with us on any questions that you have. And again, just thank you for your time. Thank you for your commitment to children, youth, and families. And thank you for your partnership. We really appreciate it.